first, like I said, college football, right? So you listen to this show, or even if you don't, and this is your first time, I am not an SEC guy. I've said this ad nauseum. I'm not from this part of the country. I'm not particularly a huge SEC fanboy. And with that, I've kind of pushed back on a lot of the narratives that you hear about the SEC and college football. And I'll get to that in a second. But with that said, I'm also an average college football fan. I've talked to people in the know in college football, and I'm not an idiot, okay? I'm not saying the SEC is not the best conference. I think you'd probably have to be stupid to say that, right? Or just not watch. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there are certain narratives that do deserve pushback, and there is a blatant SEC bias in the college football media and in the college football playoff governing bodies, and we can see that. Now, with that said, let me say again, I'm not saying the SEC is not the best conference. As a matter of fact, I'm admitting the SEC is the best conference in college football. They have great players, they have great teams. I get it. But what I'm also saying is that it is top heavy, like every conference. And let's be real about that, right? Now, that top might be a little larger than it is in other conferences. For instance, you look at the Big Ten, the top is probably, Michigan, which is kind of back in play as one of the best teams in the conference, maybe Wisconsin, and of course, Ohio State, right? If you think about it, maybe you could put Penn State in there, but Penn State doesn't generally win the big games. But anyway, that's the top of their conference. And the Big Ten is generally regarded as the second best conference in college football. Now, when I say the top is larger in the SEC's top is probably going to be, of course, Alabama, which holds up the entire conference. And I'll get to that shortly. Alabama, Georgia, LSU, and some years Florida, right? And those teams are tremendous. I get it. They pump a lot of dudes into the NFL. They're a pipeline. Now, there's something to be said about that as well. And we'll get to that too. But what really irks me is this narrative that the SEC teams are better just by virtue of being in the SEC. And that doesn't really pan out, right? It doesn't generally pan out in bowl games. Now, I know what you're going to say. The SEC wins all the championships. I get it. But since really, how many championships does Nick Saban have? He's got 7, right? So, of course, Urban Meyer got his 2 at Florida. You saw Les Miles get one with LSU. And then, of course, Orgeron got one a couple of years ago with LSU and Joe Burrow and that fireworks show, which might be regarded as one of the best and most talent-laden teams in college football history. I get it. But then you talk about teams like Georgia, which people regard as a top-tier team in college football. I don't agree with that. And so let me real quick jump on why I don't agree with Georgia being a quote-unquote top-tier team in college football. They have top-tier talent. Okay, Kirby Smart's a tremendous recruiter. They play great defense, so on and so forth. I get it. But we saw last week, after all year long, when 2 weeks ago, after all year long, when everyone was talking about Georgia being generationally great defensively, and this is the year that they get past Alabama, so on and so forth, right? Well, what did we see? We saw when they played against Alabama in the SEC title game and got it handed to them, that when Georgia plays a team with comparable athletes and comparable coaching, they lose. This is just amazing to me, right? So, I'm a Notre Dame fan. So I'm going to make this example, and I'm pretty sure I brought this up on the show before. People get on Notre Dame because they get to the big games, i.e. the college football playoff, and I think they haven't won a major bowl game in like 30 years. Probably since, I want to say, 1992 Sugar Bowl, where they beat Florida, coincidentally, an SEC team and the all-ball coach. But this is not a story about that. The point is, people get on Notre Dame because they haven't won these big games. Fair enough. They haven't been good enough. Yes, I, a Notre Dame fan, am saying that. They have not been good enough. I get it. They go into the college football playoff. They get smacked around. I get it. They haven't been good enough on those big stages. No question here. No argument. Now, with that said, they haven't won a national championship since 1988. So their days are gone and blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's fine. Georgia hasn't won a national championship since 1980. Herschel Walker was suiting up for Georgia the last time they won a national championship. Now the guy's 50 plus years old running for state senate in Georgia. So I don't understand how the hypocrisy keeps coming into play. But what is that? That's indicative of the college football media and indicative of the pro SEC stance that many people hold and the bias, right? Georgia is so great. They're so elite. They're a top tier team. No, they're not. They're at the top of tier 2, Notre Dame, just below them. Fair enough. Okay. So with all that said, now you have the SEC sends more guys to the NFL. Every year you see the SEC in the NFL draft breaking its own record for guys drafted in the first round, guys drafted overall. I totally get it. Got a lot of studs down here. I live in Jacksonville, Florida, so I know there's a lot of studs down here. High school, college football is life in this region of the country. I totally get it. No argument. However, let's use our heads a little bit. If we go ahead and look at the all pros, right, at positions in the NFL, or if we go ahead and look at the top 5 at every position as per Pro Football Focus, the SEC doesn't really dominate. They're very high on that list in running backs. They're very high on that list in defensive backs. I get it. But most of the positions are pretty much spread out around the rest of the college football world in terms of where the players in the top 5 at their positions went to college. So there is some groupthink there among NFL executives. So again, let me point to Notre Dame, right? Widely considered as not having as good players as those major SEC programs, your Georgias, your Alabamas, your Floridas, your LSUs. Correct. Again, I'm admitting it. Notre Dame, on the whole, does not have the amount of dominant players, right? They are recruiting well. They've got a ton of 4 stars, but when it comes to those 5 stars, Notre Dame might have 1 or 2. Those SEC programs I just named might have 8, 10, 15 in the case of Bama, Georgia, maybe LSU. Okay. So with that said, if you look at last year's NFL draft, let's talk about how many guys Georgia got drafted. Georgia Talent Factory, outstanding program. Georgia sent 9 guys to the NFL. They got 9 guys drafted. That's incredible for any one school. Guess how many Notre Dame sent? The team that isn't good enough, I've admitted this, the team that doesn't have the same level of talent. Oh, wow, they tied Georgia for the second most players getting drafted with 9. Go figure. See, this is what I talk about when I talk about the narratives, right? Why let facts get in the way of a good story? The narrative, it doesn't fit. So this is what I talk about when I talk about the SEC groupthink among NFL execs and decision makers. This is what I talk about, the SEC bias in terms of the college football media and the pro SEC slant that we often hear. Okay, cool. So I've given you some information there. I've talked about the majority of, that's the other thing, right? The majority of those draft picks who come out of the SEC, of course, all the teams send guys. There's no question about that. But the majority, like most conferences, comes from 2 or 3, maybe 4 schools. And it's Bama, Georgia, LSU, and Florida. Those are the majority. So we talk about the whole conference when the majority come from what, 1/3 of the conference? So, I mean, I don't know why it's so hard to be objective and just use common sense and reason when we're looking at this. No one is trying to say the SEC isn't great. But if you're going to argue that it's not Bama holding up the conference, wrong. If you're going to argue that the SEC produces all the best players, wrong, right? I'm giving you the information here. If you look at the Big Ten, Michigan, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Penn State, they pump out a lot of players too. Those are also NFL blue bloods in terms of sending guys to the league. Now, it might not be quite to the same extent as those 4 I named from the SEC, but could that again be the fact that, Alabama's winning all these championships and there's a huge spotlight on that conference? Could be. That has something to do with it. Now, let's take it to on the field. The Armed Forces Bowl was a couple of nights ago. Mizzou, an SEC Southeastern Conference team, played Army, a service academy team, a team that rarely runs and is, I think, the number 1 rushing team, number 1 or number 3. They're a top 3 rushing team in the country, as they always are. They run the triple option, very difficult to defend. They played Mizzou. Mizzou had the SEC's leading rusher this year. He didn't play. I think one or two of Mizzou's dominant defensive linemen didn't play. They had a number of players out of the game. That's fine. So where am I going with this? Mizzou lost to Army in the Armed Forces Bowl. Now, me being an Army veteran, of course, I'm happy with that. I say, so that always makes me feel good to see Army win. But That's not my point here. My point here is the SEC narrative is they have all the best players. The SEC narrative is the worst team in the SEC, according to these people, is better than the best team from anywhere else, right? This is what you hear. This is the type of nonsense that you hear. But Mizzou got beat by Army, a service academy, a very good one, mind you, the best of the three, but they got beat by Army in the Armed Forces Bowl. Why am I bringing this up? Because the narrative is that the SEC has such good players and the teams in the conference have such good depth that their second or third string should be good enough to beat anyone else's first string. That's the type of nonsense that you hear. For instance, let's take it back one season. Last year in the, we're going to say the COVID year, right? But regardless, we saw Oklahoma play against Florida in the, I want to say it was the Cotton Bowl. And before the game, Florida, I can't remember who the player was, but one of Florida's players said, Oklahoma is a good team, but let's be real. They're not SEC. Okay. So they got stomped out by Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl. I bring this up to say this belief that because the team is in the SEC automatically makes them better is ridiculous. But now, what do we hear from the SEC apologists? We hear, well, Florida didn't have a bunch of their players playing. Former Florida head coach Dan Mullen said, well, we basically sent our JV team out there. But from the way you're talking, the way the college football media talks, right? The way so many SEC fans talk, the way Florida's own player talked, it shouldn't matter who's out there. You're in the SEC. That automatically makes you better. See, this is what I'm saying. You can't have it both ways. You can't say the SEC's better, got all the better players. The teams are deeper. The teams are more loaded. The teams are tougher because they go through a tougher gauntlet during the season. That may be true. So on and so forth, right? But then when it comes to it and they lose, there's always an excuse. Tell me if you've heard this one before. Well, insert SEC Team X. Team X didn't want to be there, so that's why they lost. Oh, really? They didn't really want to be there. Tell me if you've heard this one before. SEC Team X had a bunch of players missing. That's why they lost. It can't be that you have the better team, you have the better players, you have more depth, so on and so forth. But whenever you lose, there's an excuse as to why you lost. Not a reason, not a schematic reason, X's and O's, an excuse. This is what we get from the pro SEC media. This is what we get from the SEC apologists, the SEC hypocrite fans. This is what we get. And this is real. This is not me hating on the SEC. I'm sure it sounds that way. But if anyone can tell me something that I'm saying here that's not true, go ahead, leave it in the comments section. Hit me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, whatever. Let me know, because I haven't said anything here that's untrue. Now, second one, the second SEC bowl matchup of this bowl season, Florida lost to UCF. UCF's been trying to get their hands on Florida for years, pretty much since the 2017 undefeated season, where coincidentally, at the end of that season, UCF beat Auburn, another SEC school. Wow, go look at that. In the Peach Bowl. This is the same Auburn that beat Alabama and Georgia in back-to-back weeks during the regular season. But when people talk about it, they say, Auburn didn't really want to be there, and Auburn didn't have this player and that player suited up. Again, you see how there's always the excuse when an SEC team loses to a non-SEC program, but I digress. Quick side note, speaking of digression, I've heard it said that this year's Cincinnati team is the best group of five team ever. I beg to differ. I think the best group of five team was that 2017 Cincinnati team, and I think they probably could have matched up with anybody. I'd love to see him play this year's Cincinnati team. That would have been a real highlight show. Great defense versus a fireworks offense. That would have been good. Anyway, back to it. So, it's just amazing to me that there's always an excuse when we talk about the SEC, and just at the end of the day, you can't have it both ways.